There are truths that the sea keeps not because they are complex, but because there is no one left to tell them. The story of the SS Canigou is one such silence, found in a salt-stained logbook recovered from a vessel that should have been teeming with life. To look into these pages is to trace the final, frantic movements of men who realized too late that they were no longer alone on the water. The SS Canigou sat low in the water of the Bay of Biscay, its black hull cutting through a rhythmic, iron-gray swell under a ceiling of heavy clouds. On the bridge, the brass telegraph stood at a silent, full ahead, yet the vibration of the engines felt hollow, as if the ship were pushing against something denser than salt water. Captain Elias Thorne adjusted his cap, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the line between the sea and the sky had begun to blur into a singular, suffocating charcoal. Below deck, the cargo hold was a cavern of shadows, supposedly filled with crates of industrial textiles destined for the southern ports. The air here was thick, with a scent that shouldn't have existed, a sharp, metallic tang, like ozone or scorched copper, that clung to the back of the throat. A single lantern swung from a rusted hook, its flickering yellow light revealing the strange state of the floorboards, which appeared dry and brittle, as if aged by a century in a single night. The first entry in the recovered logbook was dated October 14th, written in Thorne's precise, steady hand, a hand that would, in time, unravel into a frantic scrawl. He noted a peculiar interference with the radio equipment, describing a series of rhythmic pulses that matched no known maritime code, no familiar distress signal. The crew had begun to complain of a persistent ringing in their ears, a high-pitched hum that seemed to rise from the very steel of the hull itself. By the second day, the navigational charts began to lose their utility, as the compass needles developed a sluggish, uncertain wander. Thorne spent hours over his drafting table, his dividers tracing paths that the Canigou's wake refused to follow, leading them further toward the restricted coastal zones of the French shoreline. The maps spread before him felt like relics of a world that was rapidly receding, replaced by a geography dictated by the unseen signals pulsing through the fog. On deck, the sailors moved with a heavy, practiced caution, their voices hushed as they peered into the mist, rising from the surface of the water in those unnatural vertical ribbons. There were no seabirds here, and the usual churning life of the Atlantic had vanished, leaving the ship to glide through a graveyard of absolute stillness. One man, a veteran stoker named Miller, reported seeing pale, shimmering geometries beneath the waves, though he was quickly dismissed by the officers as being overtired. The evening of the third day brought a localized atmospheric shift, one that turned the mist a bruised, sickly violet beneath the moonlight. And in the logbook, there is a quiet record of Thorne's growing suspicion that the cargo they carried was not what the manifest claimed. He wrote of a dull heat radiating from the sealed crates in the lower hold, a warmth that should not have been there, yet lingered all the same. He described a sensation, not of being watched by eyes, but by the atmosphere itself, as though the very air had become a heavy, sentient weight, pressing slowly, steadily against the glass of the bridge. Late that night, the hum escalated into a physical vibration, one that rattled the porcelain wash basins in the officers' quarters and sent the ship's dog into a fit of silent shivering. Thorne recorded the first erratic navigational shift, noting that the Canigou had turned 12 degrees off course, without any input from the helmsman. It was as if the ship were being drawn toward a specific point on the coast, a hidden coordinate that existed only within the frequency of the unrecorded signals. In the galley, the clocks had all stopped at the same moment, their gears jammed by a fine white dust that had begun to settle over every flat surface. The cook found that the water in the kettles refused to boil, remaining tepid and still even over a roaring flame. as if the very laws of thermodynamics were beginning to fray at the edges. No one spoke of it, but the men began to sleep in their clothes, keeping their life vests within arm's reach as a silent, collective dread took hold. Thorne's journal entry for the fourth morning was brief. It held only a single, quiet, chilling observation about the stars they had seen the night before. He wrote that the constellations were unrecognizable, shifted into patterns that made it seem as though they were sailing beneath a different sky entirely. The horizon had vanished completely, replaced by a seamless dome of gray vapor, a dim muted shell that caught the lantern light and sent it drifting back across the deck in soft, haunting, distorted echoes. The final slide of this first movement captures a moment of deceptive calm, with the Canigou drifting at low tide near a jagged outcropping of rocks that appeared on no chart. The crew stood along the starboard rail, staring at a rhythmic light pulsing from the shore, a light that was not a lighthouse, but a slow, deliberate breathing of the earth itself. And Thorne's last coherent sentence in this section of the log was a question. If we are being called, who is it that knows our name? The fifth day began with a silence so absolute it felt physical, as if the ocean had been replaced by a floor of cold, dark glass. Captain Thorne noted in his journal that the engines had finally been cut, yet the SS Canigou continued to move at a steady 4 knots, drawn by an invisible tide that defied the local currents. The white dust that had first appeared in the galley now covered the entire deck, dampening the sound of footsteps, and giving the ship the appearance of a ghost vessel carved from salt. By midday, the unrecorded signals had shifted, easing from a rhythmic pulse into a low harmonic drone, a sound that seemed to settle deep, vibrating through the very marrow of the crew's bones. In the log, Thorne described the men as growing listless, glassy-eyed, moving through their duties with a kind of mechanical precision, a motion that held no human spark at all. One sailor was found standing before a blank bulkhead, staring into it for 3 hours, claiming he could hear the conversations of the minerals beneath the seabed, a statement Thorne recorded quietly, without judgment and without correction. The investigation of the cargo hold revealed a terrifying transformation. The industrial textiles were gone, replaced by a crystalline substance that grew in jagged, translucent clusters from the floorboards. As Thorne watched, a single cluster pulsed with a faint bioluminescent light, timed perfectly to the drone echoing through the hull. He realized then that the floorboards hadn't been removed by hand. They were being consumed, the very wood being converted into something alien and inorganic by the ship's secret freight. Thorne retreated to his cabin, moving quietly through the dim light to consult the declassified telegrams he had kept hidden in his desk, documents that hinted at a Project Ether involving the transport of unstable atmospheric catalysts. The paper felt strange in his hands, colder than it should have been and strangely heavy, as if the ink itself was gaining mass. Outside his porthole, the bruised violet fog began to swirl into tight vertical cyclones that danced across the surface of the water without disturbing a single ripple. The logbook's handwriting began to drift across the lines during the evening of the 6th day, slowly, unevenly, reflecting Thorne's fractured state of mind. He wrote of the Great Folding, a sensation that the distance between the ship and the shore was no longer a linear measurement, but a shifting, psychological gap. The crew had stopped eating, claiming the food tasted of wet copper and old electricity, preferring instead to stand in the mist, breathing the thick, ozone-heavy air that now clung to every surface. A sudden, localized tremor shook the vessel at midnight, though the sea remained as flat and motionless as a frozen lake. Below decks, the sound of the cargo shifting was replaced by a series of sharp, rhythmic cracks like the breaking of 1,000 glass rods. Thorne ran to the hold, only to find the door fused shut, the metal glowing with a dull, heatless light, a light that scorched his palms and left behind a pattern of geometric scars, scars that matched the drawings in his journal. On the bridge, the helmsman had vanished, leaving only his heavy wool coat draped over the wheel and a pair of boots standing perfectly upright on the floor. Thorne took the wheel himself, but found it would not budge, locked in place by a force that originated from deep within the ship's internal machinery. He watched the compass dial spin in a frantic, blurred circle, no longer seeking north, but reacting to a magnetic anomaly that seemed to be centering itself directly beneath the bridge. The air began to shimmer with a silent, localized atmospheric event, a soft distortion in the light that made the rigging of the ship seem to bend and flow like liquid. Thorne described a feeling of profound weightlessness, as though the Canigou were no longer floating on the water at all, but suspended gently in a vacuum between two worlds. The shadows on the deck began to detach themselves from the objects that cast them, sliding slowly, independently, across the salt-covered wood toward the stern. The journal entries for the 7th morning are fragmented, written in a shorthand that suggests Thorne was fighting a losing battle against time and his own senses. He noted that the lifeboats were being prepared not because of a leak or a fire, but because the interior of the ship has become uninhabitable for the living. He wrote of the crew's personal effects, watches, rings, and photographs being left in neat piles on the mess tables as if the men were shedding their identities before an inevitable transition. The final slide of Part 2 captures Thorne standing on the bridge, looking out at a sea that had turned a brilliant, terrifying gold under a sun that refused to rise. Behind him, the door to the cargo hold finally buckled outward, releasing a cloud of the fine white dust that instantly obscured the lens of his understanding. His last note of the day was a frantic observation. The signals have stopped. They are no longer calling. They are here. The 7th night descended not with darkness, but with a thickening of the air, a kind of slow gathering weight that turned the moon into a pale, distorted smudge. And Captain Thorne's final entries, they were written with a heavy hand, the pencil pressing so hard it tore through the paper as he described the emptying of the vessel. He watched from the bridge, quiet, still, as his crew descended into the lifeboats. Their movements were synchronized and silent, rowed not by effort, but by the strange magnetic pull of the shoreline. There was no panic, only a profound, hollow obedience to the signals that had finally reached their crescendo. The interior of the ship had become a landscape of crystalline growth, the walls of the corridors coated in a translucent frost that hummed softly when touched. In the captain's quarters, the metal fixtures had begun to soften, losing their shape like melting wax, while the declassified reports on his desk turned to a fine gray ash. Thorne recorded a final look into the cargo hold, noting that the floorboards were entirely gone, replaced by a deep, shimmering void that reflected a sky no human eyes were meant to see. The SS Canigou was no longer a transport vessel. It had become a conductor for a force that was systematically unmaking it. As the final hour approached, the logbook describes a hollowed-out sensation in the atmosphere, as though the oxygen itself were being withdrawn. Thorne wrote of the silence that followed the departure of the last lifeboat, leaving him alone with a ship that felt increasingly like a living, breathing entity. He noted that the white dust was now inches deep on the bridge, burying the telegraph and the charts, erasing the last vestiges of human navigation. His final coherent thought was a reflection on the dead letter, a realization that the ship and its crew were a message sent to a destination that did not exist on any map. The last page of the journal is a frantic, overlapping series of circles and geometric patterns that mirror the scars on Thorne's hands. Between the drawings, a few words remain legible. The water is not rising, but the ship is sinking into the light. There is no mention of a struggle or a final command, only the observation that the stars had descended to touch the surface of the Bay of Biscay. The ink trails off in a long, vertical stroke, suggesting the book was dropped or the writer simply ceased to move as the atmospheric event reached its peak. When the SS Canigou was discovered 6 hours later, the rescue boarding party found the deck swept clean of the white dust, leaving the wood polished and unnaturally smooth. The lifeboats were gone, yet the davits remained locked in their upright positions, undisturbed, and showing no signs of use. In the mess hall, the neat piles of watches and wedding rings sat undisturbed, their ticking the only sound in the oppressive silence of the empty ship. The cargo hold was found completely empty, the floorboards missing as if they had never been installed, leaving the rusted iron ribs of the ship exposed to the damp sea air. The maritime inquiry would later dismiss the event as a collective delusion, or a tragic, undocumented evacuation due to a suspected gas leak. However, the recovered logbook was never entered into the public record, whispered to be held in a restricted archive, alongside the charred remains of Project Aether. No trace of Captain Thorne, or his 22 crew members, was ever found, and no distress signals were ever recorded by the coastal stations on that clear, calm night. The Canigou remains a derelict of history, a vessel that returned from a place where the records of men hold no weight. The ocean does not hide its secrets, it simply waits for the evidence to dissolve into the salt. Some trails are not lost by accident, but are intentionally erased by the very forces they sought to uncover. The sea keeps its own ledgers, and some debts are paid in silences that never end.